Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming, and I'm here with my friend, colleague, and co-host, Mr. Tim O'Toole. What's up, Tim?
What's up, Brian? I'm very happy to be here today.
And I'm honored that you dressed up for the pod today.
I dressed up exactly for the pod, and I've decided for every podcast from now on, I'm going to wear a suit.
This is only for the benefit of the dozen or so of you watching on YouTube, but Tim is in a suit.
Very optimistic.
Tim is in a suit. I am definitely not. Welcome to Embargoed. This is now our third episode. So before we get started, just the standard disclaimer. We're not here giving legal advice. We're not sharing any confidential information. We're just here sharing our thoughts and impressions on a variety of different topics that are hot in the news at the moment in the international trade world. And before we do get started, we do both want to say a sincere thank you to everyone. We're recording this on March 5th. Our first two episodes have been posted and are up in the world. And we've gotten some great comments and feedback from old friends, from new friends, from many different places, literally around the world. It's been pretty cool. So thank you to everyone who's been listening and giving positive feedback.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, I really have had a lot of interesting conversations with people about the podcast, and it feels really good. So we appreciate it, and hopefully you'll enjoy the next ones.
Yeah, and we would love to hear from you with good, with bad, with ugly criticism. If you don't like Tim's tie, if you don't like my haircut or my beard, whatever.
Go easy on the tie.
Go easy on the tie, but anything is fair game. So we're easy to find: LinkedIn, Twitter, email, whatever. Please let us know what you think. So without further ado, let's get started. We are going to start in a place where, not surprisingly, is Iran-centric. We're going to start with sort of topic one is kind of 1A, 1B. We're going to start with the Halkbank criminal case in SDNY, because there's been some recent developments there. And then we're going to pivot to a broader conversation about Iran and kind of looking into the crystal ball, reading the tea leaves with respect to what may be going on right now with U.S. and Iran, because I think there's some interesting signals out there that there might be some movement perhaps in the background. We have some theories, which we're going to share with you. We've left our tinfoil hats at home, but we are going to share our theories with you. So in terms of Halkbank, for just as a quick primer on the Halkbank case, this goes back now several years in terms of sort of the life cycle of this case. There were, as many who follow this may know, there were two cases that were brought against individuals that were connected to Halkbank and the scheme that was alleged to have happened, which is, without getting too in the weeds, essentially the essence is Halkbank, which is a Turkish state-owned bank in Turkey, is alleged to have engaged in a kind of massive sanctions evasion scheme for the benefit of Iran. And it's sort of taking proceeds of the Iranian national oil company and converting them to gold and engaging in fraudulent transactions that were meant to look like humanitarian transactions and a whole host of other things. The indictment is it's a long, interesting read. I would encourage anybody who's interested to go look at that. But for our purposes, it's kind of a multi-year sanctions evasion scheme involving a Turkish state-owned bank and Iran for the benefit of Iran. So a few years back, two individuals, Reza Zarab and Mehmet Attila, were facing individual charges in connection with that same scheme in SDNY. Zarab ended up pleading guilty. Attila went to trial and was ultimately found guilty after a jury trial. And so now we're a couple of years later, and late last year, there was an indictment that was returned against the bank, against Halkbank. And the most interesting, so first of all, it's noteworthy that a large state-owned bank is charged criminally in the United States for violating sanctions and a whole host of other things. That just doesn't happen very often. Usually you see they might go on the SDN list, they might be subject to other administrative penalties by OFAC or State Department or other. You don't see many large state-owned banks that get charged criminally, so that's notable.
Companies in general are not going to trial, or at least charged in a criminal court
Right.
with court proceedings before some sort of plea. It just doesn't happen very often.
That's also true as a general matter. The wrinkle that kind of goes along with that is the fact that Halkbank is charged, and they are trying their hardest to not actually make an appearance in court to contest the charges. They're trying to have U.S. lawyers enter what's known as a special appearance to essentially just contest jurisdiction of the U.S. courts and the U.S. government to even have this case against them. That's in the shorthand version.
Very, very common in civil cases.
Correct.
In fact,
and we've seen this in a case that I'm very familiar with from my time in government out in San Francisco regarding some state-owned entities in China and theft of trade secrets and economic espionage relating to DuPont. That was a case where there was a similar tactic that certain entities just didn't show up for years. And so here, that's what it looked like was going to happen, is that Halkbank was just not going to make an appearance. They were going to try to have U.S. lawyers make an argument that they were not subject to U.S. jurisdiction without actually submitting themselves to the jurisdiction of the court. And then a few interesting things happened. So they go back and forth on this. That is kind of shot down by the court. It goes up to the circuit in the Second Circuit. And then there's a motion for contempt that's filed in late January by the U.S. government, which essentially takes a very aggressive position, which says, if Halkbank does not show to make an appearance, we're asking the court to impose essentially a daily monetary penalty of $1 million a day for the first week, double that for the second week, double that for the third week, double that for the fourth week, and on and on and on. So it just escalates and escalates. So you could get to some pretty massive numbers pretty quickly under the government's theory of the sanction to be imposed for contempt. So within a matter of a few weeks, all of a sudden now Halkbank's lawyers are saying we need to get some approvals from the board of the company, essentially the government in Turkey. And once that happens, we're going to make an appearance and we're going to come for an arraignment. And we're going to be back on track with a normal kind of criminal procedure. So my initial question, what do we think happened? What do we think it was? Was it the contempt motion from the government? Was it something else? What do we think changed the tune here? Because this is a pretty dramatic shift.
Well, I mean, look, from a purely rational basis analysis of this, the fines were big. The bank could have gotten in all sorts of trouble if it didn't show up, including you really can't get a default judgment in a criminal case. So a trial in absentia is not had, but there could have been a contempt finding. There could have been huge fines. They could have been so big they would have put the bank out of business. OFAC could have designated the bank immediately, put it out of business that way. So they were facing a lot of risks. And so I think if you're just looking at this, purely on a rational basis standpoint, you'd think maybe they just caved. On the other hand, those threats were there all along and they didn't cave. They went into it kind of fighting and kicking and screaming, and then all of a sudden something changed. And so potentially, given the involvement of Turkey and the fact that, at least according to media reports, the U.S. government has been involved in some of the other stages of this case, particularly in the Zarab trial, where there were reports that there were negotiations at the highest level of the administration in order to send Zarab back to Turkey at the request of President Erdogan. It certainly is possible that there were discussions that were had outside of court between the U.S. and Turkey that also produced this result.
Right. And also keep in mind that in addition to those two governments, we have the Iranian government that's also somewhere in this, because, again, the underlying allegations are that Turkey was essentially acting in a conspiracy with the government of Iran to evade sanctions, to help them kind of launder proceeds that were sitting in accounts with them.
Well, one thing about this case that I've always thought was interesting, and it's not unique to this case, is that the money that was being moved back to Iran, allegedly by Zarab, using Halkbank, allegedly by Attila, and he's now been convicted of it, all of that was indisputably the money of the Iranian government. It was their money that was sitting in a Turkish bank. And the Iranian government, I mean, people may not know this, but the Iranian government has money sitting in banks all over the world because one aspect of the sanctions, especially at the beginning of this sanctions regime and earlier back in the Obama administration, had been that countries that wanted to continue to buy Iranian oil from the government of Iran could get waivers from the U.S. But the way the waivers worked was that if you say Turkey got a waiver, so we can be concrete about it, the way that the waiver would work is Turkey could buy Iranian oil, but it had to put the payments for the oil in a Turkish bank that the Iranians couldn't get at. And so that's the money that these people are accused of moving around. And so, yeah, the Iranian government has a big interest in this case because essentially what the scheme that's alleged is that the Iranians were essentially stealing or evading sanctions in order to get their own money.
That nobody would do. Yeah, that's exactly right. So that is an interesting dynamic that's behind this. So I think that's a good place. So again, 3 governments that are certainly involved in some form or fashion in this case. And in terms of evaluating what may have caused that sort of flip-flop on the part of Halkbank, I think that's something to bear in mind. And so I think with that is a useful point to pivot to the broader point that we want to talk about now, which is essentially what's up with the U.S. and Iran these days. Because I think there have been a number of interesting events over the past few months. I'm going to run through a timeline very quickly, and then we'll kind of break down. Tim is a master of theories. He's going to lay out
my aluminum foil hat on.
He's going to put the tinfoil hat on, and then we'll sort of take it from there. So if we go back, we rewind a few months. We're back in October now of 2019. There is the Treasury Department in the U.S. announces what's known as a humanitarian mechanism to allow trade in humanitarian goods with Iran. And for those who are familiar with this, you know that has always been allowed. There are exceptions to the general embargo to allow for humanitarian and medical goods of certain kinds to be exported into Iran. However, since the ratcheting up of sanctions the past couple of years, it's very, very difficult to find banks to help you do that business, to process payments, to issue letters of credit, to just do any of the sort of typical functions that you would need to do to exercise or to execute any commercial transactions. So this mechanism is clearly, by their own terms, they say we want to minimize the role of the Central Bank of Iran. We want to minimize the likelihood that these types of goods get diverted for the benefit of the IRGC or other bad actors in Iran. We want transparency and enhanced due diligence. And we are basically opening this up to foreign governments and foreign banks. Come talk to us. And if you want to be involved in this and do a good thing for the citizenry of Iran, please do that. That's in October. In December, there's a prisoner exchange, and it is a U.S. grad student who had been incarcerated in Iran for, I think, 3+ years on charges of espionage, who was swapped for a man named Masoud Soleimani, who was a stem cell researcher who had been charged in federal court in Atlanta for essentially trying to violate the sanctions by taking out controlled goods out of the U.S. to Iran, having to do with his research. And there was a bit of a cause célèbre in the scientific community because a lot of people said, well, this is unfair. He's being persecuted for just doing what he thought was sort of, everyday academic or medical research, right? That's the sort of part and parcel of that. So there's a prisoner swap there. And I can tell you, having been involved in some of these in government, this goes to the highest levels. So this is the White House that decides to do this. And in fact, the day it happens, the president tweets about it and is kind of very complimentary of the Iranians, which is not consistent with how he typically talks of them. And some unnamed sources at the time were sort of indicating like maybe this is a goodwill sort of step to be taken that might start to more discussions among the two countries. Of course, just a few weeks later, then the drone strike on General Soleimani, and then the retaliatory strike by the Iranians. And we covered this a couple of episodes ago, so I won't go into details. And then another executive order from the U.S. to ratchet up sanctions to cover 4 new sectors of the economy that hadn't previously been covered. So where are we there? I don't know. But what we will say about that is, and Tim and I have talked about this a lot, as sort of high as the tensions got at that moment, it all kind of seemed to blow over relatively quickly, given the gravity of what was going on there. And there were people talking about, are we about to go to war with Iran? And this is, almost 2 months ago now, and things kind of quieted down very quickly thereafter.
I mean, not only did they quiet down, I mean, so there was one of the ways that the sanctions were ratcheted up, particularly in the fall, was that various Iranian governmental actors, including the Central Bank of Iran, were declared to be global terrorists. And so the sanctions that are against Iran generally are bad, but the sanctions against global terrorists are worse. And putting the CBI onto the specially designated global terrorist list meant that even with respect to humanitarian trade, the Central Bank of Iran couldn't be involved. Right. And so that actually made it even harder to finance humanitarian trade.
Right.
After the Soleimani strike and the tensions heat up and new sanctions are imposed against Iran, recently, kind of without fanfare, OFAC ratcheted down the pressure on CBI. It actually created a General License 8, that allowed humanitarian transactions to go through the Central Bank of Iran. So it actually started to ratchet those sanctions down. Around the same time, Germany actually did a prisoner swap with Iran, and Germany swapped out at a person who had been arrested at the request of the U.S. They swapped essentially the U.S. Iranian prisoner for a German that was being held in Iran, and they announced it during a security conference in Munich while Secretary of State Pompeo was there, and the Americans said nothing. And that, I find that pretty weird.
The silence speaks volumes.
The silence. Yeah. You would think that this would have created some sort of big incident if the Germans had done this, at least without American acquiescence. And
as reported, that we believe that the extradition proceedings had essentially wrapped up, and he was ready to be sent to the U.S.
The only thing that was left was for the German government to sign off on
and
the
hand
extradition.
him over. Yeah, exactly. And so, so those two events, so Khalili's release, and then the humanitarian, the general license for CBI, and the related guidance on the humanitarian trade that sort of backed up what was introduced in October of last year, and the introduction of the very first one of those programs with Switzerland, where that's now been established. That was just in very end of February. That was the 27th of February. That pretty much takes us to the present. And then just this week, so again, we're recording this March 5. Just earlier this week, it was widely reported that the Atomic Energy Authority has recently, based on their recent inspections, they've confirmed that Iran's enriched uranium is now tripled in the last several months. And so they're well above the thresholds that they agreed to under the JCPOA. They're now creeping up on an amount of stockpile that could lead to what is known as sort of a reduced breakout timeline to actually have a nuclear device. And they also said that there may be other sites in country that they believe are also hiding away stockpiles. So that's pretty provocative, and that's getting a lot of attention. But I think buried within that, or the flip side of that, is a lot of observers are saying, well, what else are they supposed to do? If they have to signal some kind of strength, and they have to signal that the U.S. is not going to push them around, this is maybe the only way to get the U.S. back to the table, is to just say, well, if you're not bound by the deal, if there's no deal, nobody's following it anymore, even though the Europeans desperately want to keep following it and keep it in place, then we're gonna do this, even though we're saying we're not gonna build a bomb, but we're gonna enrich, and you have to deal with those consequences. And is that enough to sort of nudge everybody toward further discussions?
Yeah, and I guess to me, the bottom line here, the reason that I have kind of this whole, if not a tinfoil hat, an aluminum foil hat on, is there's all these instances of restraint between the U.S. and Iran over the last few months. Setting aside the Soleimani blow-up, but even that ended in a way that was pretty surprising, with kind of both sides backing down quite a bit. And then all these other things that we're talking about are kind of a ratcheting down on the U.S. side, restraint, and essentially you have both the Iranians and the U.S. exercising way more restraint than they had been exercising over the past 2 years. And the question in my head is, well, why? Why are both sides behaving much more responsibly? You'd think that in response to the uranium enrichment, we'd have all sorts of threats or escalations coming out of the U.S., and we're not seeing that. So why is the U.S. kind of being much more restrained than it's been? Why are the Iranians don't seem anxious to amp up the temperature between the two? It's really hard to figure out. And one possibility is that there are talks going on, and that's why things are happening, because they're pursuant to unspoken agreements that we don't know about, but that are taking place.
Or at least there's some understanding that both sides will kind of stand down for the time being in terms of lobbing rhetorical barbs at one another, right, and try to keep the temperature relatively calm while this plays out. I mean, in the delicate dance of diplomacy, all of the signals are there that there is something going on.
Right.
What exactly, we don't know. We're to be clear, we are truly kind of speculating, reading the tea leaves here. And I think this is also complicated by the fact that here in the US, we're in an election year, and the idea that that this administration would either be able to get a deal done that could essentially supplant the JCPOA, or that the stars would align to have that happen in the next 6 to 9 months seems to be hard to fathom. But it's, you never know.
Right. I mean, so the only thing that I would say to that is that it just seems very different than it was 6 months or a year ago, where both sides seem to be going out of their way to escalate, and there wasn't any pretense of prisoner swaps, or there weren't things that were happening where there would be one side would really escalate and the other side would kind of de-escalate, and then there seemed to be almost a mutual de-escalation in connection with the Iranian strike that was responded to by sanctions that were, for the most part, I mean, we talked about this last time, they were for the most part superfluous. And so and then ratcheting, I thought a big change was this general license that related to the Central
CBI,
Bank of Iran, because it really seemed designed to help humanitarian trade in Iran in a way that the U.S. government has gone almost out of its way to say, on the one hand, over the last year, yes, humanitarian trade with Iran is fine, and then do almost everything in its power to
make
stop
it more
that
difficult.
from happening.
One last point on that, and I think we should probably move on, but in the frequently asked questions that OFAC released relating to the General License 8 and the humanitarian mechanism that's now in place, there was an FAQ that is released, and I'll see if I can find the number here. I think it's 823, FAQ 823, that says explicitly, non-U.S. persons generally do not risk exposure under U.S. secondary sanctions if they engage in this conduct, with a few caveats. But OFAC does not issue guidance like that.
Right.
We have asked for guidance like that. Many people have asked for guidance like that.
I think I was one of the asker of the frequently asked questions, or maybe 10 of the askers of the frequently asked questions. I mean, we were frequently asking this particular question
exactly
and
right.
never got an answer.
That's exactly right. And yet now they have decided that they can put something out into the world like that. They never do that. I cannot stress enough that this is really some fairly outlier behavior from OFAC in terms of being that clear about, don't worry about secondary sanctions. They never say that. So I agree. I think feels like it's something a little different. So, what that ultimately means, we will see, but that's, for now, we'll have to keep a close watch. And as I'm sure everybody realizes by now, I'm sure we will be talking about Iran on our next pod, and probably forevermore until the end of time. So,
unless we're talking about Venezuela.
So let's go to that. Item number 2.
So Venezuela, we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but basically over the last 2 or 3 years, the U.S. has consistently been increasing the sanctions against Venezuela, and the policy behind the increase in the sanctions is important. So basically, the U.S. is of the view that the Maduro government is illegitimate. They're trying to essentially replace the Maduro government. They've actually selected someone that they believe is more legitimate as the ruler of Venezuela, President Guaido. The theory of the sanctions is that it is not designed to punish the Venezuelan people. It's not even really designed to punish the Venezuelan governmental institutions writ large. It's designed to punish what the U.S. would refer to as the Maduro regime. And so these sanctions are targeted at essentially trying to preserve Venezuelan institutions and to preserve essentially the Venezuelan oil industry, but to stop the Maduro government from what the U.S. views as essentially exploiting and wasting Venezuelan assets, and
Natural
mainly
resources,
Venezuelan oil, but other natural resources as well. And so the reason that is important is because that informs what the U.S. has done in terms of the sanctions against Venezuela. On the one hand, a year ago, the U.S. put PDVSA, the national Venezuelan oil company, which is by far their most profitable and most valuable asset, onto the specially designated nationals list. So it made PDVSA and SDN, and then about 8 months later, it made the government of Venezuela and SDN. And so it made it very difficult to do business with the government of Venezuela, very difficult to do business with PDVSA. It created a bunch of exceptions. And one of the exceptions to that has been that there is a general license. It's General License 8. There's versions of it. It's gone from 8A to 8E now, is what it is. And the general license it allows certain companies that have joint ventures with PDVSA, because one way that the Venezuelan oil business operates quite often is that the PDVSA, the national oil company, will own a portion of the company that then gets the oil out of Venezuela, but it's often a joint venture with U.S. companies, European companies, sometimes Russian companies that own part of it. Now, usually the way that the resources are divided is that the foreign company, like the U.S. company, will come in and build the infrastructure to get the oil out, and PDVSA, which is the national oil company, and so it owns it as a result of it being in Venezuela, essentially contributes the resources from Venezuela, but the infrastructure is provided by these other companies. And so General License 8 allows those joint ventures to continue, even though at least certain named ones, Chevron is one of them. There's 4 other companies that also are named on the general license. It allows the joint ventures to continue in a way that they wouldn't be allowed to continue otherwise, because dealing with PDVSA as an SDN is potentially sanctionable, and if you're a U.S. person, it's also illegal. And so General License 8 allows those joint ventures to continue. Now, why does it do that if PDVSA is off limits? The reason is kind of getting back to this original point. We're trying to preserve the infrastructure so that when President Guaido, or someone that the U.S. views as legitimate, takes over the government of Venezuela, the oil fields are not out of business. The oil fields are still working, but the general license is set up in a way that's designed to try and keep PDVSA from getting money that would then be sent back to the Maduro government to keep it operating.
And you can also imagine if Chevron were to pick up and leave Venezuela, then what happens is the government swoops in and just takes that over, essentially commandeers the facilities down there, and that's even sort of compounds matters.
Right.
So that's exactly right. So Tim's point about the underlying reasons for the sanctions are really important. And so I think what I kind of see here, so the recent reports are, so this most recent general license that was reissued in January, so it's 6 weeks ago or so, mid-January, January 17, and I believe, so we're talking about mid-April when this is going to expire. It's 90 days. And there are reports from unnamed sources who are clearly coming out of either the Treasury Department or the White House or the State Department, is that this is it. We're not doing this again. And we're going to pull the plug on this general license, and all these companies are going to have to pick up and get out of Venezuela. Now, to Tim's point, why would they do that at this point? Well, I think in terms of the ultimate goals of the sanctions, which is to get Maduro out, which is legitimately to cause regime change. And I think they felt like they had him on the ropes a year ago, and he was about to go, and everybody recognized President Guaido as the legitimate leader, and yet Maduro clings to power. He's still around, and he hasn't gone. And so I think if they pull the plug on this, and if they sort of choking off at least another sort of source of significant revenue for PDVSA and the state, and couple that with what we saw also recently, which is a designation of a Rosneft, a Russian sub based in Switzerland that was trading in Venezuelan oil, another signal that they're continuing to try to fence off and sort of cut off every bit of oil revenue they can, that getting Chevron out of there and getting some of these other U.S. players out of there, that could be a real kneecapper for the Maduro regime. So I think this is a card they didn't want to have to play, but now they may feel like they need to play.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really risky strategy, though, because on the one hand, it essentially puts PDVSA and Maduro in charge of these oil fields, whereas currently because you've got these American companies that are there and doing business. They are, they're the beneficiary of General License 8E, so they are going to make sure that those terms are complied with and that the sanctions are complied with on the areas that they're continuing to operate in. In a way, they have every incentive to do it, and by all accounts, they're doing it. And so OFAC in the U.S. has some control over those joint ventures in a way that if you kick them out, they completely lose control over that because it goes to PDVSA. The other thing that my understanding is that these U.S. companies are doing is that they're maintaining the oil fields in a way that, because the sanctions have deprived PDVSA and the Maduro government of resources, they may not have the resources to do. And so by kicking the U.S. companies out, if that's what they decide to do, they're taking the risk that A, PDVSA will control everything, and B, PDVSA won't maintain it. And so you may have chaos in these oil fields. And so if they're really worried about wasting assets, these oil fields, if they go to, if they go backwards 10, 15 years because the oil wells degrade and it could be an environmental disaster, it could be an economic disaster. All the people who are working in the oil fields could lose their jobs. And so I agree that it seems to be they've decided that this isn't creating enough chaos. And so, pulling out the U.S. will create more chaos in the oil fields. But to what end, I guess, is really the question. And the Rosneft designation kind of is the other part of the strategy, because if you pull the U.S. out and you stop these joint oil fields from operating, you've also got to make sure that there's nobody to buy the oil if PDVSA is running it. And so I think that's where the Rosneft designation is that it's essentially saying, and anybody who is operating in the oil sector of Venezuela, which is sanctionable currently, is at risk, even if there's not a U.S. nexus. And so there's a lot left to come in Venezuela, but I do think that this could be, this threat, if it is carried out, could be a big turning point in terms of just trying to create total chaos in the Venezuelan region and then see what happens. Now, to be fair, the last time this general license was up for renewal, the same sort of stories came out. And so I do think you have to take what's happening now with a little grain of salt. Yeah. It's not up until April 22nd. And so between now and then, things could change. It could turn out that there's another general license 8F in April, and we're talking about this again in 6 months. But I've seen other signals in other areas of the Venezuela sanctions that make me think that there is a turning point that's happening, and the policy may be to create more chaos in Venezuela.
Right, and I think that's exactly right. It's hard to know how much of this is we can sort of take to the bank, but in any event, I think we're about 6 weeks away from the expiration of this general license, so keep an eye on this. By the time this goes out to the world, we'll probably only be about 3 or 4 weeks away. So it is definitely worth monitoring. And I would also expect if they do pull the plug, there'll be a wind down period. There'll be some other things. But still, we're talking about perhaps within the next few months, another pretty significant inflection point with respect to the sanctions program targeting Venezuela and Maduro specifically. So we'll have to wait and see on that. So I think with Venezuela now behind us, so we have Iran, Turkey, Venezuela. Now we're going to go across the world to China and North Korea, because we also can't get through more than a few minutes without talking about these folks as well. And so item number 3, earlier this week, just on Monday actually, there was it's sort of a dual criminal and administrative action against a couple of Chinese nationals relating to a massive money laundering scheme assisting a North Korean state-sponsored hacking group that hacked some cryptocurrency exchanges to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, apparently, allegedly, according to the charging documents and the public statements that the Justice Department and the Treasury Department have made on this. So we'll go through this one pretty quickly, but I do think on the last episode we did reference the one individual who had traveled to North Korea who had been charged with sanctions evasion, and that was relating to cryptocurrency as well. The North Koreans clearly, because of their sort of the length of time that the embargo has been in place and the severity of the sanctions from really all around the world, given the position of North Korea with respect to the sanctions that we see not only from the U.S. but from the UN as well, and other parts of the world. They are definitely in the vanguard when it comes to the crypto game, and when you see, and obviously based on some other prior activities, I think their cyber capabilities are also sort of in the vanguard as well with respect to their ability to hack or intrude, whether it be banks or obviously these cryptocurrency exchanges. So I think we said this the last time, and I think it bears repeating. This is an area where I think there's going to be a lot more action in terms of both on the criminal side and the administrative side for sanctions generally over the next few years. And I think we're just starting to see the tip of the iceberg on this. So this case, I think, is a useful reminder of that. I think a couple of other sort of related points that I'll make and then throw it to Tim. Another good reminder that sort of China is the gateway to North Korea in the eyes of the enforcers here in the United States. And so coming down hard on Chinese individuals and institutions who are involved in sanctions evasion, money laundering, and the like is a high priority for our government here in the United States. This also was, as I said, a coordinated effort. We have a criminal case. We have a forfeiture action that's sought against hundreds of millions worth of assets and accounts that were allegedly linked to this hack of the crypto exchange, and OFAC acted at the same time to put these individuals who were allegedly responsible for the money laundering piece on the SDN list. At the same time, under, I would note, both the North Korean executive order, one of the North Korean executive orders, and one of the cyber executive orders. So dual authorities that are cited for the designation. And so I'll throw it to you there. That I think it's sort of this, just without getting into too much detail about all the facts here, which are complicated. I think it's a useful sort of data point in terms of the evolution of these types of enforcement measures.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a ton to say about this, but one thing that struck me was kind of when I was getting ready and kind of reading some of the background materials on all of the matters that we've talked about, is how Halkbank seems kind of so 2012 in terms of sanctions evasion. So, the sanctions evasion was that they were essentially moving money from a Turkish bank account to an Iranian bank account by taking blocks of gold out to the Middle East and selling the blocks of gold, and then kind of sending the proceeds from the gold sale to Iran.
It's literally analog sanctions evasion versus digital sanctions evasion.
Yeah, and so now what you've got is, no, we're not going to go sell a bunch of gold and kind of convert it into like dollars and like carry it across the Persian Gulf in boats in order to get into Iran. We're going to hack into the banks themselves, pull a bunch of crypto out, and then just open up and put it into an account we've created. And that's how we're going to evade sanctions. And we're going to create all these fictional accounts digitally, and we're going to do it immediately and from our computers sitting in China and North Korea. So it seems like there is a much more modern way to evade sanctions. And so Halkbank really does look like a very old-timey, kind of very legacy type case.
Not to say that type of evasion is not still going on, but yes, a point well taken. And I would say directly related to that, and this is the last point I'll make on this. I think this matter also highlights something that's again kind of a brewing challenge and dilemma, which is on the compliance side, both for exchanges and other sort of links in the crypto blockchain universe. How do you actually guard against this stuff? As reported here, it's a pretty traditional kind of malware exploit that's used to do the hack, and then the Chinese actors are the ones who are taking the money out ultimately. And how are you vetting those accounts? How are you vetting those users? And then the banks that are linked up with these exchanges when things are flowing into these accounts, how are you vetting that? What are you doing from the sanctions compliance, AML compliance standpoint? Those are really challenging questions. And I think to some degree, and we know this from questions we get from folks in this area, that this is still kind of early days for a lot of these people, even the ones that want to get it right. It's challenging to sort of figure out how you do this in practice, given the way that this is all the systems and the connectivity that we're talking about here, and the anonymity that you're talking about in a lot of ways with certain elements of this. So I'll just put that out there, and then
No, I think we're going to hear a lot more about
Yes.
crypto hacking China and North Korea. I mean, we know from our practices that the China-North Korea link is one that the enforcers are very, very interested in right now. And this is a good example, but it won't be the last example.
All right. So with that, let's leave North Korea and China behind, and let's go to another continent that we haven't really talked about today, which is Europe and Switzerland in particular, to do our last big item.
Right. What would a podcast be without an OFAC settlement?
Yep.
And so there really was only one since the last time that the last podcast that we did, and it involved an entity called Société Internationale de Télécommunications Aéronautiques. We'll call them SITA because that's the initials. And SITA is basically an international body that facilitates aviation worldwide. And it turns out that, and you know, SITA provides communication services. It actually provides baggage tracking services, which is all good, and they do this for many airlines around the world. But it turned out that some of its customers, longstanding customers, in fact, were Mahan Air, Syrian Arab Airlines, Caspian Air, three entities that have been on the SDN list as specially designated global terrorists, SDGTs, which we talked about in connection with the Central Bank of Iran. And so
for years.
For years, since basically
14, 15.
And I think Mahan might even date back to 2011. And so they've been on the list for 9 years now, and they were members of SITA and taking advantage of these aviation facilitation services for quite a long time. OFAC found out and did an investigation in which SITA apparently cooperated. What struck and eventually SITA caught this, removed the membership, stopped providing the services, but then also settled with OFAC. One thing that struck me about the settlement action is when you tallied up the number of violations by the maximum penalties for the SDGT. I think
it was massive.
I think that the maximum penalty was something along the lines of $13 billion.
It was 2.4 billion was the statutory max.
Max, okay.
Now the enforcement guideline number was much lower than that, because we're talking about 10,000 violations almost.
Right.
So
I mean, that's that's one of the things is that once you let an SDN into your system, the number of violations tends to compound really rapidly, and so these numbers get huge. Here, I don't think OFAC saw that there was any intentional attempt to provide services for SDGTs. They just kind of got involved in the system, didn't really know what to do about it, and turned out not to do something that OFAC thought was permissible.
Yeah, I think two interesting points on this from my perspective. One is, again, it's a Swiss headquartered entity that had U.S. touch points that were not super obvious. They had a messaging service component that was routed through the United States. They had software that was U.S. origin, and they had a tracking component that was hosted on servers in the U.S. So. These are not, this is kind of a classic case of perhaps not really mapping and knowing your risk well enough to understand where the sanctions problems could lie, right? And so, again, encourage people to look at the summary of the enforcement action, which is on OFAC's website, because it takes great pains to kind of, lay out in some detail what these U.S. connections were, and essentially the failings on the front end to not pick that up, or to pick it up but not deal with it appropriately.
Right. I mean, I'd say we see it's got kind of two components that we see in so many different settlements, so many different prosecutions, so many different charging documents. It is on the one hand, there's either a failure to recognize, but more often kind of a failure to know what to do when you discover, especially when a non-U.S. company discovers that they're dealing with an SDN. Yep. And so if they catch it at all, they catch it in a way that is not helpful. And then the second thing is a failure to recognize these U.S. touch points. That is that I think that a lot of non-U.S. companies, understandably, think that if they're operating in Switzerland, if they are operating without U.S. dollars, if none of their people who are working there are U.S. persons, that they're not providing what they view as U.S. technology or U.S. services, that they don't have enough of a connection to the U.S. to be worried about U.S. sanctions. And I agree with you that OFAC really did go through the U.S. touch points in some detail, I think because it wants to send a message to other companies that they better go through their U.S. touch points with the same sort of detail when they're trying to work through sanctions issues.
Yeah, I would add, too, that here in particular, this is aviation, right? And Mahan and Caspian Air and Syrian Air, these are, I don't want to call them notorious necessarily, but these are well-known kind of sanctioned parties that are involved in a lot of, have been involved in a lot of alleged bad conduct over the years in many contexts. And so these are pretty, if catching it, this is not the problem. It's then what do you do about it? And as Tim said, sitting in Europe and not probably understanding necessarily how your systems are set up and what your U.S. touch points may be, that is a pretty common problem that we see in a lot of cases that both we've done ourselves for clients or that, are the subject of these enforcement actions. Aviation also, it's worth saying, I think, is just an area of focus for it always has been and probably always will be for OFAC in terms of imposing sanctions, because it's kind of high impact to make sure that these sanctioned parties in the aviation industry are isolated from the U.S. So that's something else to bear in mind. And then, my last thought on this, in the settlement, they run through all of the steps that have now been taken by the company or will be taken to sort of put in place an appropriate risk-based compliance program. This is continuing the trend that we've seen over the last 6 months to a year, where it's a pretty standard playbook now, very consistent with the OFAC compliance framework and guidelines that were issued last spring about what companies need to do to have in place sort of a worthy, in the eyes of OFAC, compliance program to deal with these risks.
Right. I think, Brian, you make a great point on the industry by industry, and OFAC calls out civil aviation as a high-risk industry. It's done that pretty recently in connection with the shipping industry, in connection with oil and gas. Yep. So if you're in industries that OFAC calls out, you should probably be nervous, because we don't generally just see one aviation enforcement action at a time. We see
there's a bunch.
Over the year,
there's a bunch of files sitting on somebody's desk that are waiting to be dealt with.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and the banks know that well, because they were a high-risk industry, and now they're less of one, but they're
still are,
but they're not.
They're better. They're farther along in the compliance program and sort of evolution cycle than some of these other industries, for sure.
And the other thing is that if you're in the aviation industry, you should be looking very closely at all of the measures that SITA took to enhance its compliance program, because if you wind up with OFAC reviewing your compliance program, it's going to probably be looking for the same sorts of things. So you may want to think about implementing as many as you can now.
Exactly. Okay. So with that, we will wrap up. That sort of wraps up the main portion of the pod for today. And without further ado, we're going to go right into the lightning round. We have 3 topics we're going to hit quickly, and then we're going to wrap up. So starting number 1, and again, we pledge we're going to try to be more lightning than we have in the past. Yeah. Oh, that's nice. We might need a sound effect, but for now, that'll do. Let's start with number 1. We can't get through a pod without mentioning Huawei. A lot's happened with respect to Huawei since we talked about it a few episodes ago. At the time, the news was that there were about to be some crushing enhancements to the Huawei restrictions put in place by the U.S. government. That got scuttled at the last minute by objections from the Department of Defense, but then that got revived very quickly, and there was rumored to be a cabinet-level meeting that was going to happen at the end of February, where those restrictions were going to be revisited, along with a few other China-related trade restrictions as well. That meeting, apparently, by the reporting, I believe I saw this in Reuters first, that meeting got postponed and is now purportedly going to happen in about a week. At the end of the next week, we're somewhere around March. I think I saw March 12 was the date. So the question is, and also I should add that at the time that the meeting was on the books, the president tweeted suggesting that further restrictions were bad for business in the U.S., and which is exactly the reason that the enhanced restrictions got scuttled in the first place, because DoD and others were worried that it was going to be crippling to innovation in the U.S. and to key strategic developers, manufacturers here in the U.S. that they rely on and that our economy relies on heavily. And apparently the president agrees with that, because he's tweeted about that. And there was a lot written about how he was kind of undercutting the more hawkish elements of his administration and Congress, who are keen to really put, kind of blast Huawei back to the Stone Age, so to speak, with all these restrictions and go hard against China on all fronts. And so I think where I'll leave it is, what do we think is going to happen here? I don't know that we know anything more than we did a month ago, but I think we're putting this out there because this bears watching closely, because this is a big one. This is important.
I mean, it's a classic tension, right? I mean, sanctions are always bad for business. If you put sanctions on a company that is buying billions of dollars of U.S. products, and you say you can't buy any more U.S. products, that definitely hurts the buyer, but it hurts the seller too. Right. And so ultimately, this is a battle between, who do you want to hurt? Do you want to hurt the buyer bad enough that you're willing to hurt the sellers as well? Or do you think that what the buyer's doing is not bad enough to injure a bunch of kind of innocent bystanders in the U.S.? And so far, it seems like President Trump is on the side of the let's not do a lot of collateral damage. Even if that means that Huawei keeps doing things that we don't like.
Yeah, we're not going to put the screws to Huawei any further. So I think that just, again, we mentioned that quickly here at the end in the lightning round, just to sort of keep focus on this, because I think this is in the headlines almost every day, and we'll certainly be talking about it more when something eventually comes of this. But that's, for now, I think we'll leave it there. Big question mark on that one. So moving on to item number 2.
So item number 2, very quickly, I just wanted to send a ray of hope to all of those companies out there on the SDN list. On Monday, buried below the big press announcement related to the Chinese crypto hackers was this kind of final word about, quote, delisting of 2 Russian entities. And apparently there were 2 Russian entities that had been placed onto the SDN list in June of 2017 because they had provided oil to North Korea. Their response to being placed on the SDN list was apparently to stop selling oil to North Korea. That was a good move. And then create a compliance program so that they would try not to sell oil to the North Koreans or anyone else that was subject to sanctions inadvertently. Another good move. And OFAC responded to those good moves by delisting them and announcing that sanctions are intended to bring about positive change of behavior. And it described this as a positive change in behavior. And so we wanted to add this feel-good story about how if you just change your behavior, you too can get off the SDN list. Now, we do have a lot of other clients who've changed their behavior too. So OFAC, if you're listening, it's a good message. You should send it more.
Yeah. On Tim's last point, very quickly, I think that, there's a lot of legwork that goes into making that case, right? You can obviously talk is cheap. How do you prove it? What do you really need to do to establish that behavior has been changed? What level of detail, what level of sort of transparency do you need to go to? What level of proof, quite frankly, do you need to furnish to OFAC to get them to agree that behavior's really been changed to a degree that you should be taken off the SDN list? So that's the big question, ultimately the secondary question. But Tim's correct, and we do see this obviously from time to time. But we thought it was an interesting counterpoint with the big splashy announcement of the Chinese individuals that were added in connection with the North Korean activity to shine a little light, a little ray of hope on our friends at the Independent Petroleum Company in Russia.
There's your message of Russian hope and change.
There you go.
Today.
We can all live in harmony. Moving on to the last topic in the lightning round. This one is true sanctions trade nerd stuff here. So I'm just warning you in advance. And Tim's got some strong feelings on this one.
Very strong.
So back last summer, OFAC issued a new interim final rule basically amending and updating the reporting requirements relating to blocking and unblocking transactions and rejected transactions. And at the time, there was a big brouhaha in the sanctions bar, at least, and I think in a bit broader than that, but certainly we were part of a number of these discussions because it extended the rejected transactions reporting requirements beyond financial institutions and beyond funds transfers, which is what they've traditionally been, which is obviously pretty limited. And they, by the text of the regulations, they seem to open it up to everybody and everything, sort of every U.S. person, everybody subject to U.S. jurisdiction who had a rejected transaction now had a reporting obligation to OFAC. And so there was a lot of discussion about what does that really mean and how broad is this really, and do they really mean it to be this broad? And there was a lot of hand wringing and a lot of head scratching about what this would really mean. Well, just a few days ago, they finally came out with some FAQs to address this, and lo and behold, they don't really clear up much other than to say we expect everybody to follow these rules, all U.S. persons, not just banks. And it really was meant to be broad, and good luck. That's really, and by the way, the fundamental question, what does it mean to actually reject?
They ignore it.
Not addressed.
They ignore
not
it.
defined, not addressed. That is the fundamental question here, and it's not addressed.
Right. I mean, so the reason that people couldn't believe that this went beyond financial institutions, this reporting requirement, was because with financial institutions, it's pretty easy to determine what a rejected transaction is. Somebody tries to send a wire and it gets rejected. And so then the financial institution reports that to OFAC as to the rejection and why they rejected it.
And to be clear, there's a distinction between rejection and blocking for those who don't know. Blocking means you take it and hold it. Right. Rejection means it just doesn't go through. It just doesn't go through.
Okay, yes. So that's pretty easy. But then they come out with this new rule that says, okay, so this is going to extend beyond financial institutions. Okay, so OFAC regulates more than financial institutions. Fine, they can have some sort of reporting requirement. They say it applies to rejected transactions, but they don't tell us what rejected transactions means outside the financial institution context. And that is where the craziness comes in. Because if you are a company that makes stuff and you're thinking of selling something to somebody overseas and you're like potentially going to enter into a contract, and then your compliance department reviews it and decides, hey, we're not going to enter into that contract because of sanctions reasons. Normally what would happen before this is you would reject the transaction in some sense because your compliance people told you to, or maybe you had a lawyer who gave you advice to reject the transaction, so you don't do the transaction. There's no wire that's instituted. It just doesn't get very far. Without a definition, those sorts of rejected transactions are potentially reportable now, even though you're also supposed to report the reason for the transaction. And so the reason could often be legal advice of either inside or outside counsel who've told you to reject it for sanctions reasons. The other party doesn't often even know why you rejected the transaction and never would know but for this whole reporting requirement. And so there's all sorts of questions now about what has to be reported and whether or not this thing is going to try and intrude on attorney-client advice, whether or not you have to report transactions, how far you have to get before it becomes a rejected transaction as opposed to one that never got off the ground.
Right. Essentially, one quick analog that I'll throw out there and then we'll wrap up is in the criminal context, there's the concept of a substantial step, right? Have you taken a substantial step in furtherance of a conspiracy, a criminal conspiracy, let's say? Here, where's that line? What is a substantial step to say that there's a rejection? And there's a definition of transaction in the rule, but it's pretty broad. And to Tim's point, it clearly could cover just ordinary kind of commercial activity and compliance and individuals and lawyers stepping in and being like, no, we can't do that because of this. And if there's no contract in place, if there's no real offer and acceptance, is that a rejection? I mean, I think this is a big question mark. I think opinions vary as to where you draw this line. And I think over time, OFAC has said maybe we will issue examples. I tend to think that they're not going to do that because they would rather leave this be a big, undefined, kind of messy area that people who are risk averse are going to just stay away from and are going to over report. And we don't know, and we don't have enough track record yet, I think, with our clients to know kind of where, and it's going to be very case by case, very fact specific.
Outside of the financial context,
Right.
there is no fair notice whatsoever at this point as to what a rejected transaction is. And nobody knows. OFAC doesn't know. I think they would provide guidance if they knew what it was, but I don't think they even know what they
And that is a useful echo of the ExxonMobil case. And I'm sure somewhere down the road that, there could be a fight about this, or could be litigation about this for exactly that reason. So we will wait and see. That, like I said, that was some pretty in the weeds stuff right there to wrap up with today. But
it was fast.
But it was fast. Yeah, there we go. Pretty lightning. So and with that, I think thanks everyone for tuning in again to Embargoed. As always, this is a lot of fun, and we look forward to doing this again in a couple weeks. Please, again, feel free to reach out. You can find us on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on email. We're easy to find. We'd love to know what people are thinking about the pod. We'd love to know future ideas, future questions, anything that you'd like us to address down the road. And any final thoughts before we wrap up?
2 final thoughts. One, podcasts@milchev.com. Send us your questions. Send us your comments. We really will do a mailbag edition
at some point.
Some point in the next couple of months.
Absolutely.
And the second one is stay sanctions free, my friends.
Stay sanctions free. Thank you. Until next time.